I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then after that, we're going to give them a moment to reflect on Virginia's presentation and also maybe reflect that to some of the work that you're doing currently. So first, I'm going to, Virginia is here as one of the panelists, already introduced, and then Joel Fariss. Hi, Joel. Joel Fariss is a design and strategy leader with the global design firm Gensler. He is deeply interested in the opportunities that sit at the intersection of disciplines and in the forces that drive human behavior. He has worked with clients around the world to deconstruct stagnating complexity and design human-centric organizational structures, engaging environments and operating models that drive creativity and innovation. Before joining Gensler, he was an innovation advisor for the Seattle Mayor's Office. The influence of his work has been highlighted by Wired, The Urbanist, and Fast Code. So thank you for joining us, Joel.
Thanks for having me.
Great. And Anjulie, Ganti, and that's good?
Yeah.
Thank you. Anjulie Ganti is an educator and consultant in the fields of social work and public health. With a focus on intersectionality and social justice, Anjulie helps create spaces where people can live as their whole selves. Her work is rooted in facilitating the examination of one's own biases and encouraging people to dive into their vulnerabilities, ultimately freeing them to deeply engage with those they desire to serve. This fall, she joins the faculty of the University of Washington School of Public Health as senior lecturer. So thank you for being with us. And Kirsten Harris-Talley, a former Seattle City Councilwoman. Kirsten works for Progress Alliance of Washington as program director leading investments in organizing and electoral advocacy by communities of color, women, and youth-led organizations. She is active in the Block the Bunker or Pound Block the Bunker and Pound No New Youth Jail movements for policing and incarceration reforms, and a founding board member of Surge Reproductive Justice. So thank you, Kirsten. And Kirsten, as long as we're there, would you like to take about 5 minutes? And
Yes, I really appreciated, if folks haven't had the opportunity to read Virginia's book, I highly recommend it. I think it's deeply rooted in the history that we need to observe about how we got here. And what I always appreciate, I try to be a 20% problems, 80% solution person, and I really appreciate reading a book that gives some context of a path forward. As I was listening to, how we got here, what really rang out to me is the evolution versus revolution sort of framing, and I think that's a really good frame for us to sit in. My husband and I often talk about how excited humans seem to be for technology and the advancement of tools and not actually rooting ourselves in the deficits of that tool and whether it's actually meeting our needs. So what that looks like is I have literally been in meetings, right, where we're having technical difficulties and we'll spend 20 minutes fixing a PowerPoint instead of just spending 5 minutes printing them out and starting the meeting. So these are the kind of things we as humans are doing as we attach ourselves to the tool and don't think actually about, is this the most effective path forward? And is this the tool that's actually meeting the need? When I think about these technological systems and where we are as an evolution versus a revolution, we have to root ourselves in the fact that this country and our entire economy is built on the assumption of slavery. Flat out, period. Period. This prosperity and measures and questions we ask that measure whether or not jobs are good or bad or our economy is healthy is rooted in that reality. And to this day, we assume that there is going to have to be some form of slavery for prosperity on the other side. Right. What that means in this moment is that we've actually exacerbated the speed at which we have disparity of wealth. So that means that literally 8 human beings in the world own 50% of the wealth in the world. I'm going to say that again. 8 human beings in the world own 50% of the wealth in the world, which means when we're talking about whether or not austerity is the answer, The answer is no. Because we have more than enough, we simply are not placing those resources where they belong to actually create equity. We could have equity tomorrow with a whole redistribution of resources and redistribution of jobs and what measures we're using. The other thing I'm highly aware of is that we, in data questions, assume that by having data, that we're on the right path without actually exploring whether or not we're asking the right questions at the root of the data that we are collecting. So what does that mean? It means that we don't actually have the measures we need to know how deep and rooted the problems are before we begin to solve them. So then we can't actually ask the question, is this tool meeting the need? Is this the right tool for the job or not? Because we don't actually know the context and depth of the problems that we're trying to solve. For what that looks like here in Seattle means that we know that about 12,000 people in our region are sleeping on the streets in tents. We don't actually have a very accurate measure of how many are also sleeping in cars or sleeping somewhere that's not going to be a permanent address for more than 20 to 30 days at a time, which means the question of who has and has not is actually deeper than we actually know because we don't have that data and information. The other thing we're not doing when we're asking folks to be plugged into these data tools, we're not asking base questions that we know we need to ask about their access to digital tools and digital information. When you were talking about the example of someone just missing signing the form or missing checking a box, those sorts of things I can imagine happening. The digital divide is quite deep in our region despite our huge technological access and advances in our region. And people's ability to actually have consistent internet and access to internet is actually far deeper in the areas with the biggest use of need for a human safety net. So rural areas, isolated areas, they actually have the deepest digital divides. So literally we're asking folks to utilize technological tools that they don't have what they need as a basis of a computer and internet and those sorts of things to consistently use that tool. And we're not doing a very good job on the governance side of actually building robust tools for you as service providers either. We're not giving you the time or the tools or the best use of technology either. So I think we really have to go back to this root of asking, are these tools serving us? Do we understand the context of the question? And are we solving the problems that we're trying to solve?
Thank you, Kirsten. Anjulie, can you provide some reflection on?
Can I keep up? I don't know.
Yeah, try to keep up.
Ooh. Who needs a little breath here? Every time I hear you, Kirsten, I think, I want to be like you. And then I think, but I don't know if I can. I just have to be me. And I don't know, I'm still working out how to do that, right? And that's we're all pretty awesome, so I just want to throw that out there. And so are all of you for doing this work, right? Like, you are here doing this work, and there's a reason you are inspired to do this work. And a lot of when I was reading your book, Virginia, and really thinking about it, I realized, and I've been talking about this at SJI, where it just brings me way deep into my love of sci-fi and really makes me think critically about what is happening. What is happening? So here we are sort of saying, hey, we need to work faster and harder and be more efficient, and so let's let this machine do this. And what really struck me about your book and your talk today is, this empathy override. You can say, you know what, we'll literally outsource the hard work instead of being with and finding solutions with, right? And that just made me say, gosh, the way that we can counteract all of this is to reconnect with our humanity, to just remember that we're human. And I remember a time when I was always on my Facebook, right? Or do people do that? Who's checked their Facebook today, or Twitter, or Instagram, or hi? I'm not trying to shame nobody. I'm just curious if that's the reality, because I'm assuming most of you are looking at these things. So I decided one day that I was going to take a break. You know how people write you the email like, I'm not avoiding you, I'm just taking a break from social media. Okay, so I wrote this email, and I have been in exile for 6 years. I've not gone back. So I learned what Instagram was, I think 6 weeks ago. I learned I'm in this cave. And so when I see people that I haven't seen, and Kirsten and I met a long, long time ago, we had a real catch up. a real one, where we were together, connecting, reconnecting, catching up and understanding. And here I thought I didn't need no kind of technology, some curated understanding of someone's life, and also the funkiness, like I've been reading about you, happening for me. Like, oh, I'm working with you, let me read your stuff so we can, so I feel like I know something. And I think that's what we have to offer. I think to me that antidote is, who am I? How can I be with? How do I get back to this humanity? And actually exactly what you're talking about, Kirsten, I was writing slavery and genocide all over this paper, and I thought, can we have that for breakfast? And the deal is we have to, because the whole reason all this stuff works is because there was a moral decision to dehumanize from the very, very beginning. And this world would not look the way that it looks unless we can dehumanize someone to the extent that we can look back on what we did and hide, and never want to talk about it and never want to see it. And that is the scar that we all have to deal with. And so to me, it's what we have to do is get deep inside, notice the abundance in our hearts, notice that we can connect and we can rehumanize ourselves to making this better. So we have it, we can do it. And I just hope that we'll have lots more opportunities. I know we will to reconnect with that, to know that we can not be so afraid of this machine and all this, what did I call it last night? Judgmental math going on, harming us.
Thank you, Anjulie. Joel, would you like to respond?
Sure, yeah. I would echo your sentiment a bit, Anjulie, in saying that I feel like the least qualified person to be up here. But I've been learning a lot, and I know that I'm going to learn a lot from you today as well through the workshops, and I'm really excited about that. So it's an honor to be here. And I think listening to this talk this morning provoked a lot of questions for me. I think that the thing that I have a really hard time cutting through is just the massive complexity of these issues. There's this intersection of this belief system, right, that Dr. Eubanks was referencing in terms of who we believe should be accessing certain human rights. But then there's also this technology issue and how technology is created and who it's created for. And then there's the notion of caring for others and what does that look like and what's the function of that and the mechanics of loving each other and being a community. And so there's all of these very complex issues that come together and intersect. And for me, it creates all kinds of new questions, which I'm really excited to begin diving into. I think the big thing for me that was that it was towards the end when you were talking about this systems engineering problem and moving from that to really thinking about this as a human rights violation issue. I think that's really profound. I think as a mental shift there, a lot can happen and a lot of progress can be made. And it puts some of these other questions aside. Some of the things that I was thinking about is the role of morality in our society, and how do we begin to unpack that further? How do we begin to agree around these things? And I think it's really hard to wrap our minds around that in our polarized society. What's the role of education in that conversation? What's the role of technology in that conversation? I think that's a really, it's kind of one category or one box of things to wrap our minds around is really complicated. I think the notion of efficiency, this is something I've been thinking about recently in my work as an organizational designer and strategist, is notions of efficiency that are rooted ultimately in a capitalist society, right? Going back to, even before the Industrial Revolution. I think efficiency has robbed us in many ways of our humanity. I think that the way that we think about value creation, the way that we think about what it means to be human, even notions of work and how much we spend doing work and what work is and how we define it, are rooted in these ideas of efficiency and productivity and optimization, right? We're always constantly trying to wring the rag tighter, and can we get another drop out? And it's killing us. It really is. It's absolutely killing us. In fact, there's been some research recently published that came out by McKinsey, it was published a white paper by McKinsey, that said that a lot of our healthcare issues today are actually rooted in our obsession with productivity and efficiency, right? And so I think that's a big issue, especially when it comes to technology for the public sector and for government services, public services. What I found in my short stint in the public sector is that when the conversation of efficiency comes up, it's always for how do we make the institution more efficient? How do we make things more efficient for the system, for institutions, not for people, right? And that's a huge difference, right? And so I think what ends up happening is you create that institutional bias and that institutional racism. You make it more efficient, right?
Yeah.
But you don't actually make it better for people. And so I think efficiency for who is a big question. Who is being incentivized, and what are those incentives, and why efficiency? And so one of the big interesting conversations right now in the world of creativity and innovation is, what's the role of procrastination? What's the role of outsourcing or not even really thinking about productivity? And there's this, the efficiency of systems and the efficiency of services, moving away from that to efficiency as a service is a new thing that people are talking about. So there's some really interesting dialogue there happening that I think that this conversation can contribute a lot to. And I think my last point is, I love what you said, that we need to push back on austerity fever. I think that capitalism and kind of this mentality rooted in a history of racism and bias really is summarized well, this austerity fever. There's not enough, right? And I think that there really is. I think that that figure of 8 people own 50% of the wealth is astounding. But it goes to show there really is enough, and so that's the encouragement that I find in all of this as my stomach is in knots. So.
Thanks so much, Joel. I think it's
Can
really...
I jump in on something?
Go
I can't
for
help it. I actually have something to jump in on all of you, but I'm just going to go with this one because it was the last thing that came to mind. And it's an incredible story and a really telling story. So I was recently on a panel in New York City around the move to predictive analytics and child welfare in New York City. And it was a really interesting panel with partially folks who were part of an organization called CWOP, which is the Child Welfare Organizing Project, which is does a lot of providing people with organizing training for parents who are in the child welfare system, and also the head of data for New York City's Administration of Children's Services, who is planning the move to this predictive analytics in their system. And so it was a tough room for him because there were a lot of folks who were parents in child welfare in the room, and on the panel as well. And sort of late in the conversation, he got pretty frustrated, I think, and defensive. And one of the things he said sort of towards the end of our conversation was, because we were talking about racial disproportionality in New York City, it's really extraordinary that it's something like, I think more than 90% of the children in foster care in New York City are children of color, right? So their disproportionality is just like off the scales bad. And we were talking about that, and he got kind of defensive at a certain point, and he said, well, I guess you all will be happy then, because of the opioid crisis, we're taking lots more white kids now. And so I think what's so interesting about that in relation to this point about the problem of thinking about efficiency and efficacy, like does the tool work as our only problem, is when we stick on whether or not the tool works, whether or not the tool even is fair, right? Like one way to define fairness is like, oh, well, we have horrible disproportionality in the prison, so let's just imprison more white people. But that's not actually the solution that anyone's asking for, right? That's not the kind of equity that we want to engage, and that doesn't get us to liberation or justice, right? So I think that it's been so interesting for me to engage folks and to see that sort of seep out, that the solution to equity is to just be worse to everyone more equally, seems to me like a horrible, this very cynical, very disappointing way to look at the possibility of ethical development and change. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it was deep. It's on video. You can see it on Facebook Live.
Of course, I won't be seeing
You
it.
can, yeah. Anjulie can't see it on Facebook Live.
So, my name's Jeff Wendland. I'm with Seattle Jobs Initiative. What we want to do is open up to the audience now to questions, answers, reflections, comments.
I think when we talk about abundance, and we talk specifically about human abundance, right, one of the things that we can't make sense of in a sort of systems engineering approach. So if you assume that all systems are closed systems, that they're zero-sum games, right, that anything you use is not available to someone else, then you're going to get stuck in this austerity thinking. But in fact, human beings are systems of abundance, and the earth is a system of abundance. If you've ever planted a potato and noticed that it produces 900 potatoes, you know that we are actually oriented towards abundance. And so Angel and Patrick both had a very complicated and ambivalent relationship with Children, Youth, and Family Services. So though they felt very much surveilled and disciplined and punished and afraid, they also both were volunteers within the CYF system. Is this incredible irony that they spent almost full-time hours like working for free for CYF, and they got great meaning and connection out of that, and both of them were very, very active volunteers. And so I want to actually invite Anjulie to talk a little bit about human abundance and systems where when we use things, they actually get bigger rather than smaller.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Okay, all right.
Put you on the spot there.
So I've been really blessed to work in Native communities, and the one thing that I've always learned at the end, always, is your wealth is known by how much you give away, not how much you keep. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking about these 8 folks, and here I'm like trying to name them, right? I'm sure we all could probably come up with at least 2 names. And I was thinking about how was it Bezos who did 2 billion towards, okay, so like that's like chump change, right? So part of me was just like, what's going on here, right? It's turning into this like, can I just throw some money at the problem? It's big money, but it's money at the problem. And I hear people feeling so great about it, and I want to feel great about it. I don't want to be judgy about it, but I am a little. Because I feel like there's so much more capacity. And I don't mean by dollars. I mean like, what can we all say and learn and do to tap into who we are, to be with and to give? I mean, whatever we receive, whatever I give, I get back so much more. And I think like at the end of the day, all of your jobs are so hard, yeah? But what you receive is huge. And it doesn't have to be everybody. It could be one person, mm-hmm. and you're cool with it being like, once a year even. So to me, that we live in this world of scarcity when there's no reason to, and then we have to act as these gatekeepers in our work. But then what happens, because we're like so just in this like, I can't work against the system. I'm trying so hard, but every time I open a window, it gets slammed and I have to open a peephole. It's like all these things that keep happening, that ultimately what happens is we start gatekeeping around our hearts because it just hurts too much. It just hurts. And I wish we could be with each other to just refill our hearts, because there is so much abundance. Like, when you think of, like, I don't know if anyone in the room has kids or not. I do. I'm obsessed with my children. They wished I was more on social media, actually. I wouldn't be paying attention to them. But when we added the next child to our family, your heart grows to envelop this other person. It's not like there's just so much you divide up, you know what I mean? And so that to me is like everyone can be welcome. We can all be with each other and refill this abundant space. And so I wish we could just be, can we just be in it? Can we just be in it? I guess that's the question. Can we be fearless? Can we be in it? Yeah, thanks.
I really appreciate that question. I think often when we're asking a question of where do we start, and we have a menu of options, I usually say to people, yes, right? Like the only way to change everything is to change everything. The definition of futility is doing things the same way and thinking you're going to get different results on the other side. I think why I appreciated the evolution, not revolution statement is because it's really recognizing that that's what we're doing. We're doing the same things. We use new words, right? We don't say the words we used to say. We say African American. We're really still talking about black people who are othered, right? Like new words, same story. And if we start to recognize that, that becomes really important. I think the central thing around, if we start really moving to an equity standard and an accountability standard, what we start to move away from, many of these systems want to just make a statement that our past is our past, everything is neutral and equal. So if we do the same thing on the input side, everyone will be fine on the other side. Equity recognizes that it's not all the same. We're not all equal. I mean, the poorhouse example, right? Like what I was also tripped up with some of the scrutiny. We were talking about the scrutiny on the recipients of care. There is also scrutiny on this particular work sector because it's woman heavy, people of color heavy, right? The scrutiny in this sector looks way different than the scrutiny in police systems, for instance, that are predominantly male and white. That is not an accident either. So that these systems, that there are these meta-scrutinies and lack of compassions that are really about the biases that are already there. If we can just recognize the biases and then overcorrect to actually address the biases while folks are in the system so that the outcomes are actually equitable and accountable, that's the path. And that means internal organizational policy, individual policy, and structural policy, and it all has to happen at the same time. Ideally, what you'd have are innovations and experiments that can be scaled up and shared over time, right? So the more you can do hyper-locally and wherever your locus of control is going to be the best. We cannot automate compassion, right? My cell phone, I love my cell phone. It does not love me back. It does mean things to me, like shut off in the middle of a need, right? Like my phone is not compassionate, but I am when I remind myself and feed that side of myself. And if I can feed that side of myself and be given room to actually feed that into my work and the outcomes of my work and bring folks along with me, that's, I think, what that looks like on a daily basis. When we're frustrated with tools that aren't actually compassionate, instead of looking at ourselves to figure out, are we compassionate and is this the tool that's helping me amplify that? I think that's where we get caught up.
So I'd like to respond to that just very briefly as well, because part of what I hear you saying is that we have to be real about the historic, deep role of bias and specifically racism in the public service system, right? It's incredibly important to acknowledge that that's the history. This from the beginning of of AD, what was originally called ADC in the United States in 1935, up until 1970, Black and African American folks were pretty much completely banned from receiving public services through these eligibility laws like man in house and suitable home that gave caseworkers the discretion to come into your house and say, like, no, your house isn't appropriate so you don't get help, or to say that there's such a thing as an employable mother whose work, either as a domestic or as an agricultural worker, was more important than their child-raising labor, right? And so you could deny them for that, right? So this is the history of public assistance in the United States. It's super important to be really, really clear about that. What I get concerned about is this sort of philosophical inversion that's happened very recently around these systems engineering approaches that says that human decision-making is opaque and unknowable, and computerized decision-making is transparent and clear. Because that's not true on either side, right? On the computer side, it's actually not transparent or clear, and that's why I want to talk to you about the proxies that they chose. And I can go down those rabbit holes all day long, because they show you where the bias creeps into the systems. We have a tendency as human beings to just think that computers are objective, and they're just not. They're built by human beings. They carry all of our human bias in them. And on the other side, it's wrong. Human decision-making is not opaque. It is not unknowable. And I think that that's an incredible rejection of our need and our duty to change and to be ethically responsible and to engage people about why they're making the decisions they're making and to talk to them about why they're making the decisions they're making. I think that work is absolutely possible and important. So as much as we have to be real about the role of bias historically, I also think we have to be real about the incredibly difficult but incredibly unsettling and powerful work of alliances that happen across the desk. Caseworkers and service providers, and clients and applicants. Because where we see the digital poorhouse actually rise, which was actually in the late 60s and early 70s, partially happens because of the power of the national welfare rights movement to create these legal changes that banned those discriminatory eligibility rules, and also because of things like 8,000 caseworkers in New York City going on strike, not for their own employment contract, but to lower the barriers for recipients and applicants, right? So what a dangerous, dangerous alliance that is. And oh, look, how surprising, they went to automated decision-making 2 years later. Right? And I think we have to know that history, and we have to know the potential power of those alliances. That's not to say that that work is easy. So I was a welfare rights organizer for close to 20 years. And so from recipients' point of view, like, it's really easy to see the front line as the face of a system that dehumanizes you. And from the caseworker's point of view, when your intentions are good and you try really hard and you still struggle to see real change, it's super easy to blame it on the recipients and the applicants. So and there's all sorts of racial and class dynamics that go into that, and gender dynamics. So it's incredibly difficult work, but it is also the work, I believe, part of the work that is actually profoundly unsettling and world-changing. Yeah, so thank you. I think that's a really important question.
I work in philanthropy. I have the pleasure of working with some of the most, wealthy folks who care about progressive policy in our region. The other thing I think that comes with this moralistic, was it pauperism? Pauperism, I'd never heard that term. That happens, right, is that, again, because our entire economic system was built on slavery, we also, wove these narratives that the way you mark whether someone's successful and smart is through acquisition of this made-up system that has paper money in it. Planet Money has this great overview of how did we make up money. It's made up. It's all fake, right? These systems are fabricated. So the thing, right, that then happened over time is we started creating laws that allowed people to keep that wealth. We made laws that said land has wealth, so let's go over to the Americas and steal people's land. That was not culturally the same. Land did not have wealth for tribal communities here. Land was abundance that was for everyone. It was a very different paradigm of thought. We created laws that said you give inheritance. Your money is not only your money. When you die, you can give your money to other people so people don't get your money, that you don't decide who they get your money. So we built this long history that if you make money, you are the smartest person who made that money. You're smart because you made the money, so of course you can solve any problem you want with your money. The piece around that, I think, in this political moment is that, when we had the Tea Party, for instance, come to rise, there have been also misinterpretations of the founding of this country. Our democracy was built on the fact that we did not have taxation without representation. It's not that we don't have taxation at all. So we've been perverting these ideas, and then they get to be self-fulfilling prophecies. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from a highly economically depressed area. I grew up in a town that's a mile wide and had 300 people in it. And it is beyond poverty. And folks there have voted against their interest of public good all the time. Anytime I owe taxes, I sit and write my check in front of my kids and I say, I'm writing a check for our whole community right now, right? I am trying to orient myself around that. When I pay a library fine, I'm just giving another bump to my local library to buy more books for my community. That's a mindset. And we as a country have to move that. The philanthropic culture has said that we can actually privatize goodwill. It's not, we do not give money to a public sector to have a democratic process. We privatize goodwill. We get to then make the moral standing who deserves it and who doesn't. Is that a good idea or not? I can be an expert just because I have wealth. So those are the ideas that we have to dismantle. They're big ideas. They're not new ideas. Again, they're reoriented ideas. It's the same thing that was happening with, aristocracy when England, the empire didn't set, the sun didn't set on the empire of England. They were making decisions all over the world with their money, right? They're starting to have conversations about it within the Vatican and the Catholic Church. There's all sorts of systems having that conversation. Philanthropy will not save us. We hope it does. It will not. And there's just as many thorns and problems in philanthropy as it is in the greater community.
So one of the again, like to be a historical rabbit hole diver, one of the most interesting moments, I talk about it in the book, but I didn't talk about it today, I think in the history of poverty regulation in the United States is the move to what was known as scientific charity in the 1890s. And it's really interesting to me that there was this move to make poverty relief more scientific, more evidence-based, and more objective during the Gilded Age of the 1890s, which is the only other time in U.S. history where economic inequality was as bad as it is now. And part of scientific charity the goal was to remove the poverty relief from the government and give it to philanthropies. And the way that philanthropies were going to deal with that responsibility is by becoming more scientific. And to me, that sounds really familiar, right? It sounds very much like the moment that we're living through right now. And so I think it's important to see those parallels. But also I think it's important, this is probably a little apocryphal, but it feels intuitively true to me, right? So one of the places where particularly tech philanthropists were really excited until just a year or two ago was education, right? And at least the sort of like old saw that I hear in the Bay Area when I do talks there is, right, so the idea was to use this massive amount of money from the Gates Foundation or other places to remake education, to use the new sexy technological tools, and then all the folks who provided that money sent their kids to Waldorf schools, right, where they played with yarn and sticks. And I think that's worth noting, right? If you're remaking the schools, you should have to send your kids to those schools, right? So there's also something about being accountable to the change you make and bearing the results of the change you make and not being able to remove yourself from that. So I'm very excited, though I know it doesn't sound like it necessarily in the book, though it does end on a rousing note, if not an optimistic note. I'm actually very, I think of myself as a hard-won optimist, and I think anyone who's spent 2 decades in welfare rights, you have to be an optimist, because I don't have the spiritual or the personal space to be cynical after doing work with such incredible people for so long. So one of the things that I learned from being in welfare rights and economic justice is how deeply these narratives that we tell about poverty have affected the way we identify or not with being poor or being working class. So one of the models that I really like is the model of the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. So that's a many-decade-old organization that was centered in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia, but is a national organization of poor and working class people's groups. And part of their key work, they see their work as being redefining how we identify so that people can see themselves inside the political identity of poor. And so the way that they define poor is if you lack any one of the basic human rights as guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So that includes education, that includes healthcare, that includes a safe job with a fair wage, that includes shelter, that includes social services, that includes family integrity, that includes the right to communication so that you can attain these rights. So if you've ever lacked any one of those things, then you absolutely have the right to identify as poor politically. And I know that that's incredibly difficult work, but again, I think that's winning work. And it requires us to re-understand and rethink our own relationship to economic inequality.
Joel, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I wanted to address one thing in the last question that was asked about you have the gates of the world who then get to decide how these problems are solved. And there's something, I think, behind that I just wanted to highlight because I think it's important for all of us, which is that we're obsessed with answers. And so what happens is folks who attain this kind of power and wealth in our society often believe the myth that they arrived there because they had the best answers, right? And it's just not true. There's a lot of reasons why they arrived there, and I'm sure you know all of those more than I could, but one of those reasons is that they asked particular questions, or they found themselves in an environment where they were positioned or privileged to ask certain questions that they could pursue. And what's interesting about this relationship between questions and answers is that we keep often asking the same questions but hoping for new and better answers. And I think what this crowd is really, really good at, that we need to continue to model for our communities, is asking better questions and not becoming wrapped up in the answers and being obsessed with the answers. Let's really be advocates for better questions. I think that our relationship to knowledge has radically changed, right, in the last 30 years. And so we need to recognize that answers are all over the place, right? Everyone's got an answer. We can go online and read all kinds of stuff and find all kinds of answers, but we're not going to get better answers until we start asking better questions. And so our social epistemology, the way that we understand what knowledge is and how we engage it, needs to shift from an answer orientation to a question orientation. And I think that this naturally happens with this crowd. And if we can just recognize that and embrace that characteristic trait of this crowd and really move forward in that and model it as, hey, we need to ask better questions, and here's some questions. And I think it's also a really good way to engage those family members and those people who maybe don't believe what we believe about what human rights is constituted by. Asking those questions, well, why, right? Instead of trying to change minds with answers, try and change minds with questions. I've found that to be way more successful. And I think that there's a lot of power in questions. Questions create space, and we're going to actually unpack this further in the workshop today that I'm leading, but questions create new space for new alternative realities that don't yet exist, right? And so I think that's a big part of this is we need to really get back to questions. And incentivize question asking. If you lead an organization or a team, please create space and safety and incentivize question asking within your organization.
Thank you.
I do want to throw one thing in about the VI Spadat and then maybe cede the floor to someone else, because I just realized that one of the things I didn't say is really important to this conversation. I didn't get there in my remarks, is I actually think there's some things that are really positive about coordinated entry. Like, one, it comes from a housing first point of view, like the idea being that, you don't ask people to reach perfection and then put them in a house. You put them in a house and provide them support to get to the next place that they need to go. I think that's really important. And I'm on the fence about, but I also see legitimacy in this idea of prioritization. Like the reality is we, in every county in the country don't have enough resources. We have to do that work to make sure we have enough resources for folks. But in the meantime, maybe there is an argument for prioritizing certain groups of people over other groups of people. What I'll say from the point of view of folks who took the survey, though, that one of the great challenges, one of the great concerns they had about it is that they felt, particularly those who didn't get served, they felt like they were being asked to incriminate themselves in exchange for a slightly higher lottery number for housing. And why they felt that way, this is actually not a bad analysis of their situation. Why they felt that way is the VI Spadat asked questions like, are you currently trading sex for money? Are you having unprotected sex? Have you harmed someone else or yourself? Is there an open warrant on you? And then it asks where you can be found at different times of the day and asks to take your picture. And then that information is shared, I think, with 160 different agencies across the county. Not all of that information, but specific information in the HMIS, that federal database of homeless information, is available to law enforcement without a warrant. Like just on the basis of oral request, a line officer can just walk into a homeless service agency and ask for information out of the HMIS. You're not required to give it to them. It's really important, but you are allowed to give it to them under federal data regulation. And so that doesn't actually make sense except for in the context of the criminalization of poverty. And so the problem is not necessarily the tools that we have for deciding who gets what. The problem is that we're existing in this system that also then says because we think of poverty as a criminal act, that we then feel perfectly comfortable using that information also to serve warrants on people, right? There's a reason to keep those two parts of social services, if you can call it that, separate. And because of this digital systems integration, we're going to face some really serious challenges about how we often talk about how bad silos are, but silos also protect people, right? And inefficiencies protect people, and lapses of communication protect people. And discretion that means you get to bend the rules a little bit protect people. And we're moving to a system where those things become the standards become more stringent and the systems are more integrated. It's not necessarily a bad thing, except for in a situation where you also criminalize poverty, which is what we do. So I think that's the thing to me that's really important. It's not so much about the prioritization, but the context and the conditions in which we're collecting and using this information. And I also think it's really hard to say that the collection of that information is not coercive. Right? So if the coordinated entry system then becomes the only way you can access housing resources, then it's really hard to say, even though they sign this like 7-page informed consent thing that says, I understand you're going to share this with everybody under the sun and I'm okay with it for 7 years. It's really hard to say that they've truly freely signed away control over their information because it's the only way, right. It's the only lottery in town, right?
Just the two things that are coming up for me in this question is, and it goes back to that proxy slide, which I think that's what, I fell out of my chair when I was reading that, is that, firstly, how we define need is so subjective, right? It's like, oh, well, that's not that bad enough, so you don't need that. And what is our bottom? I just really am wondering about what is our bottom. Each of us have a different bottom, right? In terms of what is our lowest standard of where we are and how others may think about what is us living with dignity or not, right? So there's that whole argument that is shaped by how we're socialized, our religion, our schools, our families, where we grow up, rural areas, rural versus urban, all these kinds of things. And then the other thing that was really sitting with me, and maybe this is again sci-fi because time and place is flexible, is that in this moment, we are impacted by everything that was made in 1870, forever ago, 1820, the Elizabethan poor laws.
Well, that's 1602.
1602. That's right. I knew that from social work school. Anyhow, so that's another story. I know my social work peeps. I see you. So I think so. Right now we are in that. We're living in it. Things made back then, we're in it, we're the recipients, we're the ones trying to find all these ways to fix it and clean it up and struggle with it, question it, answer it, all these things. And right now, when I think about those data points, I think, if we collect this information about this person, what is this doing, not just to the person in this lifetime? How many more generations of lifetimes does that impact? And that to me is the scary stuff. To me, that's clearly when we thought, hey, when a bunch of dudes get together and make up an app about how we're going to date each other and be with each other, we think, yeah, that's cool, I got to meet somebody. But it's creating some real problems around image and understanding who you are and what you're putting out and who am I. So I feel like that we're in a spot here where we really need to think back and think forward. So.
For me, what comes up with your question and what came up for me also in Virginia's talking and what you just brought up, we don't talk explicitly about privacy as a human right and how we are eroding at individuals' privacy for the virtuous thing of having the right data. The biggest problem with using representation as an equity standard is that, again, it's not recognizing inequity and imbalance in the system. So there are some things, there are also lies we tell ourselves about what our goals are. So the city of Seattle, when they started, now almost 3 years ago, down a path around looking at whether or not people were safely moving through the city and not getting hit by cars and buses, the campaign was 0. It is not actually realistic to have 0 deaths in an urban setting related to movement of people through space. It's actually impossible to reach that. So we keep creating these really huge visionary goals and then working backwards from those instead of actually looking at the realities in front of us. So an equitable system on the other side is maybe not, is there a representational number of people not getting what they need through our system? And more of what is a sustaining living level on the other side? How do we measure that sustainability? Do I assume that yes, because of racial inequity and gender bias, that there will always be more people than not with those biases in place who are going to be in the system, and how do I get them to a sustainability level on the other side? If those are the kind of questions we were asking, instead of widget counting, I call it, we do a lot of data that's widget counting. That's about inputs and outputs and nothing about outcomes. Are they better on the other side? Are they a sustaining level? Are their children now in a better place than they would have been? And the reason these questions are critical, for the first time, really in American history, this generation, millennials, are slated to be more than 50% in lower economic standing than their parents. We're not talking explicitly about why is that. We're talking about what it is, and the inputs and the da-da-da and the number and most diverse, and we're not talking about why it's happening. So those are, to me, come down to those equity questions. We need to assume in a biased system that there is going to be an overrepresentation of people who are othered and biasly treated by our system. What are we going to do about it?
Thank you, Kirsten. We have time for one more question.
One of the struggles that I had in my 20 months working for city government was
So
one,
specific.
yeah. Well, it was a context and an opportunity to be exposed to some of this challenge, I think, and you know, evidence-based programming, program design, evidence-based outcomes, right, is the big thing. But when I would ask, well, what is evidence? The answer was always some empirical number data widget thing, right? And so the definition of evidence didn't actually include more of the qualitative subjective factors that constitute positive outcomes. And so I think what we need to do when it comes to technology is ensure that that technology isn't just capturing that widget or that empirical data point as a reference, as a signal of some phenomenon, but empowers, and if we're going to talk about optimization and efficiency, does so in a way that equips and empowers qualitative understanding of these complex issues. As a qualitative researcher in organizations, I use technology all the time. I use surveying all the time, and we're able to get to things that are very squishy, right? Things that, when it comes time to then code that data, is often left up to our own interpretation that's informed by our own biases and that sort of thing. But what's interesting is we always take that back to the people who we're working with in our research and allow them to be the filter at the end of the day. There is a ethnographic researcher at Harvard, Sarah Lightfoot, I'm blanking on her name right now, but she has pioneered an ethnographic and qualitative research methodology called portraiture, which I think is actually really beautiful. And it's an amazing approach to understanding phenomenon from a qualitative lens. And I think that that's what we need to do, is we need to move beyond this obsession with empiricism and hard data and reintroduce some of this qualitative human mess back into our systems.